So, wow, the stuff you sent over about the North Sentinelese, it really got me thinking. I mean, you start reading about them and it's like, whoa, they're so isolated, so incredibly vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head there. And that's kind of the whole point of our deep dive today, right? We're really trying to understand uh, the immense risks they face from any kind of contact with the outside world, especially in light of, recent events.
You're talking about that whole thing with the American YouTuber, what was his name? Polyakov, trying to like land on their island. That was crazy.
Mykhailo Polyakov, yeah, back in 2025. It was all over the news. And it's not just about, disturbing their peace, which is bad enough. It goes way deeper than that. Yeah. The potential consequences are, well, frankly, they're terrifying.
Yeah, and for anyone listening who might not be like totally up to speed on the Sentinelese, can we just like set the scene for a sec?
Sure. Basically, they're one of the last truly uncontacted groups on Earth. I mean, we're talking isolated for like 60,000 years, give or take. Yeah. Living on this tiny island, North Sentinel Island in the Bay of Bengal, no significant contact with the outside world. The Indian government actually has pretty strict laws against trying to contact them, and it's for a very good reason.
Okay, so that's why what Polyakov did was so much more serious than just some like harmless, trespassing incident. It's like he said, the consequences could be devastating.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. We're talking about a population that's been completely isolated for millennia. And suddenly you have someone from, a highly industrialized nation like the U.S. potentially bringing in who knows what kinds of pathogens.
Right. And that brings us to the big, scary word, disease. I mean, why is contact with, someone like Polyakov or really anyone from our world such a potentially catastrophic event for them?
It all comes down to their immune systems. Our immune systems, right? They're constantly learning and adapting. Every time we get sick, our bodies are building up these defenses, this kind of memory bank of like, okay, I've seen this before, I know how to fight it. That's what we call immunological memory. But the Sentinelese, they haven't had that exposure. They've been living in this like bubble. So their immune systems haven't had a chance to develop those defenses against all the, the bugs, the viruses, the bacteria that are just like circulating in the rest of the world.
So it's not that they're like weaker inherently. It's that their immune systems are like totally naive to all these threats we encounter every day.
Exactly. And when I say threats, I mean threats that we often don't even think twice about. Like, the flu, the common cold, things that might make us feel a little under the weather, but for them, those could be lethal. We're talking measles, mumps, rubella, even chickenpox, things we vaccinate against, things that we've built up resistance to over generations. They just don't have that.
It's almost like, they're running Windows 95 and we're trying to install like the latest game with all the crazy graphics and processing demands. Their system just isn't built to handle it.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And the really scary part is history is full of these cautionary tales. We've seen what happens when isolated populations come into contact with diseases they've never encountered before.
Oh, yeah. The material you sent talked about some of that, like the impact of European diseases on Native Americans.
Exactly. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they brought with them diseases like smallpox, measles, even influenza. And these diseases just rip through indigenous populations who had no immunity. It was devastating. Entire communities were wiped out. It wasn't just limited to the Americas either. We've seen similar outbreaks in isolated tribes in like the Amazon, even in relatively recent times.
And it's not just about someone like coughing and sneezing on them, right? This whole concept of asymptomatic carriers, that's pretty scary in this context.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, someone can be carrying a virus or bacteria and not even know it, not feel sick at all, but still be contagious. Someone like Polyakov coming from the U.S. could be carrying any number of things. Think herpes, simplex virus, cytomegalovirus, even asymptomatic COVID variants, or drug-resistant bacteria like MRSA. He could have walked onto that island and, without even realizing it, introduce something that could be absolutely deadly to them.
Drug-resistant bacteria, yeah, that's another whole level of terrifying, especially considering they don't have access to antibiotics.
Right. In places like the U.S. where antibiotic use is really widespread, we're seeing more and more of these superbugs, these bacteria that have evolved resistance to our drugs. It's a huge problem. But the Sentinelese, they've never been exposed to antibiotics, so their bodies have absolutely no way to fight these resistant strains. Something as simple as a staph infection, a cut that gets infected that might be treatable for us with antibiotics, could be fatal for them.
It's like we're all walking around with these invisible microbial weapons that could
Yeah.
just go off in their presence. I mean, we talked about their immune systems, but the material also mentioned their genes, right? Like how their isolation has affected their genetic makeup and made them even more vulnerable.
Yeah, it's a factor we can't ignore. Their long isolation, it's likely led to what we call a genetic bottleneck. It's like, imagine a population shrinking down to a very small number and then growing again from there. That process can reduce the overall genetic diversity within the group. And lower diversity can mean a population as a whole is more susceptible to, widespread outbreaks.
Because there's less chance of some individuals having some kind of natural resistance.
Exactly. In a more diverse population, you might have some individuals who just by chance have a genetic advantage that helps them fight off a new disease. But with the Sentinelese, if a new pathogen comes along that their limited gene pool just isn't equipped to handle, it could spread like wildfire.
So unlike us, where we have like herd immunity, right, they don't have that protection at all.
Right. Herd immunity relies on a significant portion of the population being immune to a disease,
Right.
either through vaccination or past exposure. That creates this kind of buffer, protecting those who are still vulnerable. But the Sentinelese, no vaccinations, no exposure. So if something gets introduced, there's no community-level protection to slow it down.
It's like a perfect storm of vulnerability. And then on top of all that, we have the ecological and environmental impacts. I mean, I hadn't really considered that angle before.
It's a critical piece of the puzzle. When outsiders go in, they can unintentionally introduce things, non-native species like, rats, insects, even fungi or bacteria, things that can hitch a ride on clothing or equipment.
Hmm.
And those introductions can really disrupt the balance of the island's ecosystem.
Right, their whole world could be thrown off.
Potentially. It could impact their food sources, their water supply, their entire habitat, and we might not even fully understand the consequences until it's too late.
The material specifically mentioned Polyakov leaving behind a can of Diet Coke. Seems like a small thing, but
Yeah, it might seem trivial, but it's symbolic of a much bigger problem. It's a foreign object. Right. Made of materials that could persist in their environment for a very long time. And it could even contain chemical residues that their ecosystem has never had to deal with before. It's a very real, tangible example of how our actions, even those that seem harmless, can have unintended and potentially devastating consequences for their environment.
it all really makes you appreciate why there are these, ethical and legal frameworks in place around contact. I mean, it's not just about respecting their, desire for isolation, right? It's about protecting them from a potential biological catastrophe.
Exactly. International ethical standards, things like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, they emphasize the right of indigenous peoples to self-determination. And that includes their right to maintain their traditional way of life and to remain isolated if that's what they choose. Plus, you have the Indian government's laws specifically prohibiting contact with the Sentinelese. And those laws aren't just symbolic, they're about preventing exactly the kind of scenarios we've been talking about.
Right. I mean, we saw what happened with John Allen Chau back in 2018. It's a pretty stark warning.
Absolutely tragic case. He tried to make contact and ended up losing his life. But the point your material made was that it could have been so much worse. Had he survived, he could have introduced any number of pathogens to the tribe, potentially sparking an outbreak that could have been devastating, even wiping them out completely.
It's a chilling thought. The material you sent used a phrase that really stuck with me. It described the Sentinelese as like an immunologically endangered species. It's a powerful image.
It is. It really drives home the point, right? Their isolation, which has preserved their unique culture for so long, has also made them incredibly vulnerable to the microbial world we live in. And any contact, no matter how brief or well-intentioned, could trigger a biological catastrophe for them.
It's like, remember that analogy they made?
Yeah.
About Polyakov's actions being akin to introducing a deadly virus into a neonatal ward?
It's a powerful comparison. Think about it. Newborn infants, they have incredibly delicate immune systems, right?
Yeah.
They haven't had time to build up those defenses. So if you introduce a virus into that environment, the consequences could be devastating. And the Sentinelese, in a way, they're in a similar situation. Their immune systems just aren't equipped to handle many of the pathogens that are commonplace for us. They have virtually no immunity, and that makes them incredibly susceptible.
So, to recap, what have we learned today? They have this complete lack of immunological memory, a history of devastating impacts when isolated populations encounter outside diseases, the huge risk of asymptomatic carriers, the threat of drug-resistant bacteria. Their genes might make them even more vulnerable. The ecological impact of introducing non-native species could be severe, and there are very clear ethical and legal reasons why we need to leave them alone. It's a lot to process.
Yeah, it is. It's really about understanding that their isolation, which has been their strength for so long, has also become their Achilles heel in our increasingly interconnected world.
It makes you wonder, with all this knowledge, all this history, what responsibility do we have to protect those who choose to remain apart? I mean, it's a pretty profound ethical question, isn't it?
It is. It really challenges us to think about, our own curiosity and our desire to explore versus the right of others to exist on their own terms, free from the potentially catastrophic consequences of our actions.
Definitely something to think about. And for anyone who wants to dive deeper into this, the material mentions some great resources. Organizations like Survival International, they're doing amazing work advocating for uncontacted tribes. Or, you could just do some research on the principles of ethical engagement, or I guess in this case, ethical non-engagement with isolated communities. It's a conversation we need to be having. Thanks for bringing this all to light. It's been a real eye-opener.